when you look at the best work, it's always been co-creative.
You shared how we're in this like new wave of the contextual age and how we shifted from the information age over to this new contextual age. What are some of those key differences between those two waves?
The first being efficiency, work smarter, the relationship with yourself, with a higher power if you believe in one, the people you love. All of these things combine into the force to power you forward. It happens where the future Dr. X says to him, to his younger self, we need you to hope again.
Oh, it's powerful. Hey, Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks, Brandon.
Well, it's not often I get to talk to people like you. You've got an impressive background. You're at Roblox currently as their, I think, chief people officer, or you're leading HR and people. So I respect what you're doing. And you worked at Disney, Apple, Dell, and a whole host of other gigs. And you've worked around some of the most creative people. So what we're going to talk about today is really exciting to me because I haven't had a conversation like this in a while.
I'm excited about it too. Yeah, and I can't claim a chief people role at Roblox, but I'm involved with people and powering leaders, and experiences at all the places you mentioned, Apple, Disney. And I think the themes are leadership of the future, and that's really interesting for me, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, me too. We're going to talk about your book. It's called Brave Together, Lead by Design, Spark Creativity, and Shape the Future with the Power of Co-Creation. And you in the book, you talk about emphasizing like a shift from this like think different mindset, which I think comes from Apple, to working different together. And you said that Apple made that shift as well. And I think a lot of us are probably familiar with that think different mindset. So what is that shift? How is it different? And how do you see like this, if organizations adopt that mentality, evolving with the times of leadership and creativity?
Yeah. I think, and the right intent is there. It's like being innovative, right? Expressing your voice. And, Steve, when he said when we started Apple, that was the intention. But when you really look at the roots of what happened from the beginning it was co-creative. It was Steve and Steve, right? Steve and Jobs and Woz. And this is how great things happen, right? This is how bands that are timeless, create the music they do, the Beatles, right? U2. And they're always at their best when they're doing it together, right? The Avengers. And, that's been true. And that was the experience I had at Apple. And when I was hired, it was like, hey, we have 70% of the people have been here 5 years or less. They're new, right, to the company. And we can't teach them the Apple culture fast enough. And so part of the challenge for me was like, okay, how do you take this company to the next level as far as a culture? But it was already like the most valuable company on earth. So imagine it's like, help us improve. It's like, you guys are already amazing, but the opportunity was that I found, I started getting involved with these product teams. So I supported AirPods, iPhone, MacBook, iPad, all of it. And so these are, teams and big organizations, right? Talking thousands of people, right? Engineers working together. And AirPods was one where there was a lot of friction happening. And what we realized rather quickly was, we're not going to get there by just thinking different, right? If we're doing that in silos, and it's great to have innovation, and these people write white papers, PhDs, smart people, they do impossible stuff, right? And AirPods were impossible to begin with. Nobody had ever done this, right? Usually it was always a wire. It was always a wire around it, right? And, so guys who come in are like, or people, men, women, like, you can't do what you're trying to do. I was like, well, you're here. We hired you, and you're going to actually help us do the impossible. So they set out to do it. What we found was there was a lot of friction in teams, and it had to do with the silos, and it had to do with like this, it was, how meetings typically happen, right? It's like, hey, well, let's set up a meeting and then we'll talk. And then I'll tell you what we're doing. And those teams kind of would clash eventually. And what we found was there was a lot of burnout because before launch, it was like 6 to 8 hour daily meetings. And when we unpacked it, we realized there's got to be a better way to do this. And having come from Disney, and seeing when we bought Pixar, when the company acquired Pixar, there's that brain trust. And this is how they do their work. So Ed Catmull that started Pixar with Steve Jobs, they've instituted this brain trust, and it's basically a standing meeting where it's like a cross-functional staff, right? People come together from hardware, software, each group, and you build stuff together, and it's egos off the table, building blocks on the table, and it's all about best ideas winning. And so we instituted this with the AirPods, and what happened was, I would say overnight, it took some time, but it was a 1.5 hour to 2 hour or 3 hour weekly commitment where they would say, we're going to show up, we're each going to have our perspectives, and we're going to start building, this together. And the friction went away, right? You had better collaboration and you had co-creation. And so AirPods Pro, I'm wearing them right now. This is proof, awesome. Right? They're incredible products, and they just keep getting better. And by the way, they stood up a $24 billion business, which is bonkers, right? That's a whole company in and of itself. That's a big company.
Yeah.
And that's just a part of what Apple is. Yeah. And that's just a part of what Apple does.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But the best part is like, then you have these teams that are just in love with their work. They're doing the best work of their lives, and they love working together. So that was a big win all around.
That's incredible. The book, you talk about this concept called the mirror test, which reimagines experiences by focusing on the real versus the ideal. How do we use this principle to break free from status quo that a lot of these organizations are experiencing right now?
Yeah, I think, for each of us, that's probably one of the hardest things in our lives is, it sounds easy in a sense, but it's really hard. Is like, because we can all look in the mirror, right? But it's more than that. It's like the depth, right, of asking ourselves essentially the question of like, what do I need to do differently? And it's a question of humility. And the leaders, and we're all leaders, right? When we really think about it, we all have the opportunity to lead, and we all are leading. So who are we leading and how are we leading? Whether it's family, friends, team, organization. But the question really is, it goes deep, because if we wrestle with it properly, there's this reality we're facing, which is our current existence, right? And there's also this ideal version. And, if we go too far over index on either one, it's problematic, right? If we're staying the real, it's like, well, life could feel pretty brutal, right? Like it's just hopeless and it's dystopian and, all those sci-fi nightmares of where it ends. It's like, it all starts to feel like that, and then on the ideal, if we go that extreme, it's like, well, it could be Pollyannish, and you just start to see everything with like, rosy glasses, and it's like, hey, everything's better. And like, well, maybe it's not. But finding the synthesis is, what do I need to do differently to, yes, help create that, but you kind of have to start with the real and kind of feed the ideal to the real and start to build. And it takes action. It takes, steps. And really the first step we outline in the book is, and that's leading yourself with a question, but you lead with a question, and that creates, starts to create wisdom, shared wisdom with others. And that's leadership. Leadership is, how do you empower people? You just go around, if you go around and just answer questions all the time, it's like, well, that's one way to do it, but people are going to get tired of it. They're not going to like you very much, and they're not going to feel like that they want to work with. And by the way, they can go to Google and they can go to ChatGPT to get answers now. And in ChatGPT, we're finding, at least on the doctor side, it's actually, people enjoy the experience better because most doctors are, I'm not going to say they're jerks, but they're more robotic than ChatGPT.
Right? Yeah, you're right.
Right. And what does that tell us about managers, right? Or the experience they have with that? Probably ChatGPT is going to give them a better coaching experience. But this is opportunistic, because for those of anybody listening, it's like, hey, you want to be a leader, or with coach as an HR provider, you want to coach leaders. It's like, well, that's an opportunity, because, we still, you can really amplify your impact by being human. But, just it's the heart to heart stuff, being brave enough to figure out how you can do that together.
Yeah.
It makes an impact. Yeah.
I'm curious, like, how big of a role fear plays into this transformation of co-creation. I imagine like ego gets in the way of a lot of people. Actually, I think before we started recording, we were talking about The Mandalorian and how I think some random YouTube artist, they brought him into the fold in season 2, for some of the crazy technology, the AI that they're doing illustrations. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I imagine that team before probably suffered a little bit of like fear of their jobs, or wow, we're going to lose our creative collaboration. This new person's coming into the fold. Like, maybe just unpack that for me. What kind of fear are we dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, look at it. You have one guy on YouTube doing what probably 30 to 40 people are trying to do at the best studio for Star Wars, right, in the world. And so, but I think that's an exercise in mirror test humility, is like, well, hey, let's bring them in, right? Let's partner with them. And they started to co-create. That's the best answer, is ride the wave, right, of co-creation. And what it does, and what it did for them was like, they created a much better product, right? And it had to be integrated. It wasn't just like, hey, you have a standalone and, on YouTube and, I'd say anybody could do that. But the guy was a one-man studio, right? But hey, it's like, but the new world is, hey, what if we build that together, right? What if you co-create together? And I think that, if you look at some of the things that Disney has done well, they're getting a lot of flack on some things, but one thing you can't fault them for is, Bob Iger was involved in this, Steve Jobs was involved in this, and certainly Ed Catmull that started Pixar was, they brought in some great brands, but brands together, and they've created an ecosystem, right? And they basically own our childhood now, right? You got Marvel, Star Wars, Marvel. It's like, you got it all,
And now they're like recreating all these old animated movies that I watched as a kid. And it's like, I just saw the trailer for Snow White, and you're like, what is happening here?
Yeah.
My childhood is like,
now with great power comes great responsibility, right? So let's hope, this, so no pressure, right, for them, but, yeah, and I can't vouch for all of the productions, but what I will say is like, by and large, when you look at the best work, it's always been co-creative. There's a story in our book we included, it's chapter 16, about the inception of Iron Man and how that started. And Jon Favreau, who directed Mandalorian, with his gallery team of directors, which, by the way, Ed Catmull, who started Pixar, we had a hunch about this. We're like, we think he's connected to Jon Favreau. We didn't know. But Ed's an advisor, a friend of ours for BraveCore. And so we met with him. We're like, hey, we think you got something to do with, Jon Favreau. And he starts smiling like a kid in the candy store. And he goes, yeah. He said, a lot of Disney directors have reached out to me for advice. Ed was president of Disney Animation too, right? Along with Pixar once they got acquired. But he said, the one director that has ever come to Pixar and sat in the brain trust meetings and immersed themselves in that, Jon Favreau.
Incredible.
And it shows, right? He reinvents the Star Wars universe with Mandalorian, which, after, I'm not going to go there, but 7 through 9 were controversial to say the least, right? Let's say. And Mandalorian was like anybody on any extreme, like basically it was well received, right?
Yeah.
And there's a reason he created a brain trust, right? This gallery of directors that partner together. And the shorthand is Iron Man. They did the same thing. Him, and by the way, he fought to get Robert Downey Jr. there. Downey Jr. was in a down part of his career.
Yes, he was.
The suits at Marvel didn't want to hire him, and John really fought for that. And then Jeff Bridges was involved. And as they're doing this filming, Jeff said on this podcast, he's like, they didn't really have a script. Like, he showed up in the trailer, and this is like, he's a veteran actor, right? Jeff Bridges is classic. But he goes, I was scared. talk about fear, right? It's like, I didn't know it. He's like, I like having a script, right? And so, but he shows up and he goes, Favreau and Downey Jr., they're like riffing, and if he's like, well, what do you think the character would say now? Oh, well, I'll just try that, right? And they're improving, and the suits, like, I don't know if it's Kevin Feige or who, but they're sitting in the trailer like, oh, that character wouldn't say that. And Favreau's like, I don't care. That's how we're going to do it. Like, let's just keep going. And they rode this wave. And Jeff Bridges said, this is like a $200 million, whatever it costs, right, to make this. And by the way, the whole Marvel universe is hanging on this. If it's successful, they can do it. If not, they don't know that at the time.
Transformed it completely.
Yeah. So he rides the wave. And guess what? Turns out to be, what it did. Blockbuster, sets the tone for the whole, Marvel universe and beyond. So I think things like that, and we may ask ourselves, like, what does that have to do with other business or workplace? We're not a creative team. We're not in that creative world. Well, the same principles apply, right?
Yeah.
Like why are meetings sometimes so frustrating or boring, right? And disengaging? Well, somebody has an agenda and they're pushing through and they have answers, and that does not engage us, right? Especially Gen Y and Z. I mean, everybody else too, but we don't always admit it, right? The other generation, but now it's everybody. It's like, hey, meetings suck. Let's get real. But what if we reimagine meetings as a different experience that's co-creative? And how hard is that? Well, it's as simple as just start with leading with questions. What if we plant a question a week in advance? Let people just marinate on that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, some of the younger generation people I work with, they appreciate the questions in advance. Some of them are not outspoken; they might be more reserved and just need time to think. And maybe that's just how they operate. And I think as we have a lot of different working styles now, a lot like 4 generations in the workplace right now, we do need to like try to find ways to have all of them feel included and collaborate better. And we might have to flex a little bit more than we ever have.
Yeah. It's a huge opportunity. I mean, I think these things are big opportunities that, to reimagine meetings, reimagine some of these things that if we don't like it, it's like, well, maybe, it can be better, and leaders can be better.
What are some other ways that, like, if you think of, you've worked with some really creative people and teams, other businesses and leaders that you've talked to, and if you could just like observe how they are leading and structuring some of the things inside their businesses, how are they maybe stifling the creativity that they could otherwise unlock? Yeah,
that's a good question. I mean, I think most leaders, as a starting point, they may not be thinking about creativity, right? Now, we talk about innovation, and most companies know the value of innovation or unlocking that in the market. But I think what we don't always talk about is what you just asked, which is the input leads to the output. So the question of like having a lens to see creativity as important, like first, right? Because like most of what business has become is it's an exercise in metrics, right? Performance, results, and it's what it feels like oftentimes. But it's not to say that the best companies, the best cultures, the best brands, the ones we admire, they're actually kind of steeped deeply in, building things together. They're builders. They see themselves as builders. And so if a leader starts with like, hey, my team, my people, they're not your people anyways, but they're not employees, and you're not, the boss. What if you're a co-creator? What if they're your co-creators, right? And then if you set that tone with them, and then how do you treat the conversation? Well, that's different than just, I'm going to see what I can squeeze out of them. What if, what if the potential energy that's turning kinetic is like, what if it's only 10% we're getting out of them, right? We talk about the brain's potential for what it can do. Well, if that's true about people in your team, and if it is 10%, let's say, that whole 90% that's untapped, right? What if you can unlock that with, in very simple ways? And there are practical ways. We talked about leading with question. That's one. But, understanding people on a deeper level. And this isn't hard, right? It's just like, what if you approach things more like you approach your friends, right? Or people that and just have a conversation. You don't have to be so informal about it, but, just being real people and leading with your heart. Mm-hmm. People appreciate that, That's it.
You shared how we're in this like new wave of the contextual age and how we shifted from the information age over to this new contextual age. What are some of those key differences between those two waves?
Yeah, I think, the first being efficiency, very focused on work harder, right? It's industrial age. It's very manual, right? It's our hands. The next information age, work smarter. It's about information, right? It's exchange. It's like, hey, knowledge is power, right? But is knowledge power anymore? In a world of Google, in a world of ChatGPT,
right,
where you can access it at your fingertips, it's been fully democratized, right? And we're talking global, right? Generally speaking. And so I don't think we even live in those worlds anymore. People may believe we do, but the truth is this big wave of the future that's already hitting is co-creation, and the value of that and the impact of that we're seeing brands start to partner, together. We're seeing, people working in teams differently or as more collective. And this is what people want, right? And what that does is it creates a massive amount of not just value, but possibilities, right? In infinite combinations, right? Of what you can produce for product, services, and experiences, right? And then, okay, well, I mean, like we were talking earlier about the school bus thing, friend, advisor he's working with, his team and their startup, they decided to reinvent the business of school buses. And you think, gosh, that sounds so horribly boring.
Not sexy.
Right? Yeah. Like and that's the point. It's like, who's ever looking at it? But there are so many things like this, like people are not looking at, they've never looked at for decades, right? Always been the same, but they're doing EVs. They're a nice kind of luxurious ride or a better experience, which is not hard, right? It's a low bar, but it's a better experience for kids. And it's gone gangbusters. It's a unicorn company. And, I think there's things like that could surprise us about what is possible in business in particular in our lives, right? Like, co-creative conversations can happen in a marriage. They can happen with your kids. That's powerful.
In the book, there's a triangle that had at the base employees. The other point was entrepreneurship and then co-creation at the top. And you're arguing that co-creation is like where you want to be. What are some of the key differences between how entrepreneurs behave, employees behave, and that co-creator, which we're arguing that we need to be there because that's where we unlock the creativity and innovation?
Yeah, I can share these, and those listening, some of the extreme version, right? Which makes, it's kind of funny, right? Like that we've seen in the past, at least. Now this may be shifting a little bit, but the entrepreneur is like the extreme is the guy who's live streaming on LinkedIn, bragging about his Lambos that are like, behind him and the mansion that's there. That's probably green screened and the Lambos are borrowed, totally. Right? And he's like, chucking the money out. It's all about freedom, right? And you're like, well, freedom sounds pretty good like that, right? Like just it's raining, it's raining money. But the reality is probably far different. It's anybody that talks to an entrepreneur who's been through a startup. It's a version of hell. It's really hard, right? So there's a messy middle that continues. And even if it goes big, there's a lot of tough valleys, right? That's not a realistic view. And the argument that happens in those extremes is, okay, you have an entrepreneurial mindset, which says, hey, it's freedom, it's autonomy. And that's true. That is true. There's more autonomy in that sense of like, hey, I can control my schedule. I don't have to listen to a boss or whatever. And then the employee will say, well, I get a steady paycheck, right? I get, more security. And that's true as well, right? And are either points of view wrong? Well, no, they're actually kind of both right. And is it possible, we talk about there's the dialectic or Hegel's dialectic is like you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, and then you find the synthesis, right? The thesis is employees. The antithesis is entrepreneurs. The synthesis is co-creator. And the co-creator can exist in either world, or both. So someone can be an employee and be entrepreneuring. They can be building something within a company. I've seen this happen. I've been part of these billion-dollar solutions that happen inside of a company, or they could be an entrepreneur and start that, or they could do both in today's world. And there's, 60 to 70% of people are freelancing or have a side startup that they're building, right, as they're doing their work in day job. And I'd say that's new, but that's the future, right, in a sense too, because people want to express. We have our creative propensity.
You're doing it right now. I do it as well. I think it is the future. We want to build and create. No doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You wrote about turning pain into power, and we're going to experience challenges and adversity, but how do we learn from those to come out better for it and maybe unlock some sort of creativity and innovation as a result of going through that pain?
Yeah, I can share my experience with that. I share a bit of it in the book. A deeper dive is I went through, it was just a shock to my system and, personal experience, divorce, and there were some other things that happened financially, and and I just autobiographically, that was a moment for me where I realized it was a valley. It was so deep that I hadn't experienced before. I think a lot of us, post COVID or during COVID, experienced either a version of death of a loved one, some kind of sickness, a financial burden that's either happened or has continued to weigh on us. We've all had things happen. And I think the current future may feel more dystopian, right? And for me, it was a moment where I thought, wow, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. Like, this is so brutal. And what I found was, they've done longitudinal studies, Harvard has, over the course of 80 years, and asked this question of, like, what is happiness, right? Happiness is relationships, full stop. And relationships, I'd say, are what got me out of that. And that continues to be true. Now, it could start with the relationship with yourself, with a higher power if you believe in one, the people you love. All of these things combine into the force to power you forward. And that's what happened for me. And the pain that I experienced, it felt so deep. I realized that, well, the valley, when it's inverted, it turns into a mountain. And that's absolutely true in our lives. And it continues to be true, and we have different mountains to climb, different valleys that hit at different times. But I think a lot about, there's a moment in Days of Future Past, the X-Men movie, where Dr. X is facing the dystopian future. Everything's falling apart. Right? It's all imploding. And here he is, right? Of course, Jean-Luc, I'm talking about the actor. Yep. He's playing and he's experiencing this, but it's like, he has every reason to have zero hope. It's over, right? It's the end. It's end game for them. But he goes back in time and has a conversation with his younger self. And his younger self, Dr. X, Charles, is in shambles. He's got addictions. He's a mess. He's in the deep valley of his own personal life, but the world's pretty good. He's just, his experience is bad, right? But he thinks the world's ending himself. It's the opposite. But so the moment happens where the future Dr. X says to him, to his younger self, we need you to hope again.
Oh, it's powerful.
Right. And I think that's the message our future self is offering to us right now, is to hope again. And there's power. That's fuel for the future. And if we can do that in circumstances that are messy, I've realized life itself can be just one big messy middle, because there's going to be a trial and a challenge right around the corner, and we don't have to, like, I don't know, the common saying is like, no pain, no gain. I'm like, I got enough pain. I have to go looking for pain all the time. It's great in the weight room, but even there, you're like, you have to be smart about it, right? Like, you don't want to break stuff, overdo it. But the point is like, we have enough pain. Then it's just turning this into power, turning it into power.
A thought's coming to mind too, like when it comes to like working in teams or, building the next gen AirPods or whatever, and you're working with a team. Does it help to think with the end in mind? Like, here's what we're visualizing that we're wanting to create. Right now we're stuck and it's messy, but to think like that's where we're going and our future is going to look bright. Is it helpful for teams to start to visualize that? Oh,
for sure. I mean, especially when you're dealing as Scott Belsky, he's a chief product officer at Adobe. I had a conversation with him about this. It's like, especially when you're at the edge of reason, right? We have moments in our lives that can feel like that. But I think especially when you're trying to do something that feels impossible, staying focused on the North Star, right? And in this case with AirPods, it was, why are we doing this? We want to make the best product for people. Right. And what that does is that transcends any of this other stuff. Right. If personally I'm saying, hey, I want to, and I think let's say the battery team, hey, we want to build the best battery. And they start having an argument with the design team. They say, hey, well, you can't really fit that battery. It's too big. And, and the engineers are like, well, you need to get these chips in there. Everybody wants to, and they want to be known for this. It's like, hey, but if it's about your thing, and by the way, for each of those pieces that goes into this little, product, there's thousands of white papers that went into that, right? There's thousands of people, right, that are just working on that one little piece. But if they want it to be about them, you're not going to get that movie that's going to blow people's minds and that's going to, be deeply seated and anchored in their soul that they carry with them. And like a movie where the credits roll and you're like, there's thousands of people that were involved. Well, that's how the best things happen. And if people are okay with, but guess what? Then they can be so proud of the product that emerges. Cause then, those teams are like, hey, it's the whole thing. It's the thing. It's itself, right? The hero, by the way, is the customer. The hero is the people. We're giving them something in their story that's giving, powering their journey. It's not about, this person, the engineer, this person's self-promoting. And that's a different mindset. I think that is also something that in business can really help power teams and the future of the workplace. Cause a leader may come in and say, they might say it this way, but they're essentially trying to be the hero, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I spend a lot of time, I lead marketing for my organization, and I adopted this building a story brand mindset where Donald Miller's the author of that. And I think he points to Pixar and how a really good story is structured. And it's like, you got the villain, you got the hero, you got the guide. And too often in our businesses and our teams, we're trying to be the hero when it's actually the product or the service that we're trying to develop is actually the hero's the customer, the person using that product. We're just the guide.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's true, with leaders too, as they think about their teams. It's like, so, it carries through, right? So it's like hero being the product. Well, then the hero of that to help build that is the team.
Yeah.
And then for the team to happen, okay, then at that point, maybe say, hey, I can be the leader hero, but I'm going to make the hero sacrifice. Yes. And the hero sacrifice is to let go of ego, right? That's hard, but it makes all the difference.
Yeah, totally. You have a chapter called Shatter the Shark Tank, and you're pretty critical of the Shark Tank and just that whole competitive business environment. Why are you critical of that? And, how do we get organizations to transition into one that maybe prioritizes empathy and connection and shared purpose, the things that we're talking about today, which will help us innovate and be creative?
Yeah, I love that we're going there. I don't think I've gone there on a podcast recently. So I think, so first of all, I'm a closet fan of Shark Tank.
Totally.
But
Me too. It's really
it's fun.
It looks cutthroat though.
Yeah. And I mean, years ago, 10, 15 years, it was always like, and it's still true. You have to respect and love the fact that it's like entrepreneurialism I'd say it's best. These people are creating things that are making a difference in the world. But, the challenge there is like this, kind of exec boardroom, sitting in the high chair, squeezing people for all their worth, all their equity, okay. It may not be that brutal. I think the tables are starting to turn now on it because you see people show up more where they're like, they're like, give me 500K for 5%, or 1%. And then they've shifted now. Yeah. I think they're onto it. But for so long, it has been this, we're going to squeeze you. And then the behaviors, the sharky behaviors are, it's about ego, right? It's about like, what's in it for them? Very transactional, all about money, right? And these aren't motivators, and they're not sustainable motivators, right? The things that, guys like Steve Jobs, what did they talk about? Changing people's lives, changing the world, right? And in those meetings, behind closed doors, even in those companies, they talk about it that way. It's like, well, we want to reach people's hearts. We want their hearts to sing with our products, and our services and whatever those are, right? For anybody. And this could be, whatever the product or service is, people want that in their lives. And then if you build a culture that's centered around that approach, that makes all the difference.
So well said. Well, we're getting to the point where I need to wrap up, but I want to end with this because it's so fresh on my mind. I saw a clip of Eric Schmidt, ex-CEO of Google, yesterday talking about we need to have people in person to be more creative. And it was met with a lot of backlash because I think there's a lot of organizations that are and employees really want to work hybrid or remote. But how do we maybe respond to what you think about that? I'm curious what your take is on that. I'm sure you saw it. And then 2, I don't think the remote or hybrid thing is going away at all. In fact, I think we can get really creative people if we can have talent across the world working with us in our teams. How do we unlock creativity in those environments? So that's part 2 to the question.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, I think the short answer is, okay, the world's changed, and we all know this, and it's not going back to what it was, and that's good, right? And yet, I think in the collective sense of building and being builders, we have to ask ourselves, like, how does this happen? How do we do this, right? And given the context, and I would say this can probably happen in many different ways. And we're far more connected than we used to be, right? Like, I don't know, back in the 80s and 90s, we'd say, or 2000s even, it's going to be amazing. We had like that video thing to be able to talk on video. And then it showed up and like nobody used it, right? Like there I was at Apple and like we had FaceTime. We do conference meeting calls on audio. And I'm like, we invented FaceTime. Like, what the heck? But we have those tools. But, post COVID, everybody's on Zoom, right? And, or Google or whatever the platform. And I think this is a good thing. I believe too that, the hybrid future isn't going away, and hybrid in many senses of the word, right? And you could look at the co-creator thing as hybrid. And how do we build together? I mean, there is something to be said about that human connection, that personal connection.
100%. I'm never discounting that.
And so if that's like, hey, you're having lunch with somebody or however you show up, wherever that context that is. But so much can be done, in so many different ways. And building is happening, in like, so I think this is the funny thing about this. I think so many leaders who like to be known for their opinions are so eager to opine on this because they want to take a position, right?
Yeah.
And I think my position, my position is that, right? I think the position of the future is it's not that simple, right? And what it is though is what we have experienced is we brought our work home with us, right? And during COVID, that was extreme version of that. But, and my daughter who was like it was essentially her work. She was in kindergarten, but she's doing online school. She would go 30 minutes into it. And like, she's like, I'm done, close the lid and run off. I'm like, Faith, I'm like, you can't do that. You got to be on for 6 hours. I'm thinking like, who the heck at 5 years old is going to sit there for 6 hours?
Not a chance.
Horrible. Like that's nightmare fuel, right? But I think for all of us, what we did experience in that sense was, with work, we brought it home. But that's a shift, right? Where it used to be like, and that concept of like exec presence, right? How do you show up? Like, well, I want people to show up in an organic way to be themselves, right? And that's what's happening now. I think in the companies that lean into that future are going to win. And, I like the idea of a hybrid approach. I think, there's ways that remote can happen too and work. And, it's definitely not the old world of like, hey, the draconian, it's our way or the highway at all times. And everybody's I look at I did the, 5 days a week, road warrior. And I mean, the time alone of like how much that carves out from your time with your family and all the stuff. And especially when you have high traffic zones. So I'm grateful that like it's shifted. And I think that, and companies that, need to find a balance, that I think they're finding it. I think the ones that are saying, hey, maybe it's a couple days in the office, or 3 days even. I mean, even 3 days, it's like you still have, the bookends, and that's actually like a, kind of a 4-day time frame set outside of it. That's pretty good, and so I think they're finding the balance. And but that was the funny thing about, and I don't know Eric personally, but it was a funny comment because it's like, oh, that would just solve for the whole thing. And you're like, yeah, right. Like, yeah, I'm sure that would. I think actually if he tried to run the company with that attitude, it would work for like a day, just like that comment worked for a day. And then I think he apologized officially today.
I think he did too. I think because like even in the context of our discussion, I think like he probably wanted to make us stance, or maybe he was the question he was asked was like pointed in that direction. He felt like he had to make a call one way or another. But I think like it's more about how we're leading, and it probably leads to this co-creation stuff that we're talking about. It's like the leaders need to create an environment that we're able to co-create. And that's really where we need to spend our energy, is how do we teach our leaders and managers and our people to work together better? It's not about remote or hybrid or in-person work environments. It's about how are we interacting with each other and getting the best ideas out on the table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a good example too of a shift, right? And there's a shift for all of us to make. And, Steve Jobs made a shift from kind of, we call it in the book, rough Steve to change Steve. And I think if there are those things that aren't going to serve the future, hey, just make the changes, the shift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris, I love this discussion. It's one of my favorite that I've had recently. So I really appreciate it. Your book is called Brave Together, Lead by Design, Spark Creativity, and Shape the Future with the Power of Co-Creation. There's so much in this book we didn't even touch on. So make sure, if you're listening, go get this book. It's fantastic. Chris, what do you want to leave people with from a parting thought, or point people to resources that you have out there?
Thank you so much, Brandon. Yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation as well. And you could find us at bravecore.co. There's an audio book, the physical copy. There's a video book available on Lit Video Books. And we love to connect too. So I'm on LinkedIn. I think the main point I'd love to stick and to share with people is, the future it's not really as much about being self-made as it is about it's a shared future. And the shared future is not just about being brave or braving it alone. It's about being brave together.
Thanks for coming on, Chris. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Brandon.